Hello everyone, welcome to the GeoEcologist. I am Dr. Krishnanand and you have been watching my videos on models, theories and laws in human geography. In this session, we are going to learn about one of the very interesting theories that's related to agricultural location. That's called Vonthunen's theory of agricultural location. So, what is important in this theory is the locational aspect. How there is one center and in its periphery the different zones of agriculture is located. So what are the parameters, what are the attributes, what are the factors responsible for it, and also at the end we'll be learning about its criticism and application in various parts of the world. But before we go ahead, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and also don't forget to share the videos more and more. So now let's discuss about agricultural location theory by von Thunen. Now remember, it is one of the very important theory in agricultural location or agricultural geography, which was primarily based in Germany. So von Thunen was a German landowner, a farmer as well as economist. Now remember, he was not a geographer, but his ideas pertain to the locational aspects. That's why it becomes really important to understand about this theory in geography. So this theory was proposed in 1826. Now when you hear 1826, it's really important to understand that in 1826, the world was not that level of industrialized as it is now. So, very importantly, this theory is placed almost before the peak of industrial revolution in Europe and several other parts of the world. So, what you observe? The first volume, his work is called The Isolated State. That is published in 1826, and this was one of its kind because it was kind of the first serious treatment of spatial economics. Now remember, this is where the economic geography and agricultural geography combines together. An economist talks about the locational analysis right way back in 1826. Which later on in quantitative revolution phase in 50s and 60s again picked up by geographers. So remember, this was part of spatial economics and also economic geography that we say, connecting the theory of rent that is talking about here. Right? So economic rent or locational rent theory is the core of this particular agricultural location. So von Thunen initially developed the basics of this theory of marginal productivity in mathematical ways. Now remember, this was application of mathematics to agricultural location and also to this productivity factor in terms of economics. So how was it summarized? This was the first part that he talked about before actual locational theory. So this was basically theory of marginal productivity, which he formulated by this particular formula that you see here. R is equal to Y bracket P minus C bracket close minus Y FM. Now this formula is basically talking about the marginal productivity. So R here is the land rent only, which became further the basis for the locational analysis, and also Y is the yield per unit land. That's important. Then C is production of expenses per unit of commodity, how much you spend per unit of commodity in terms of expenditures. Then P is the market price. F is the freight rate. Now remember, freight rate is according to the weight of a commodity that you transport from agricultural location, agricultural place to the market. That's important. And M is the market distance. That was important here. So all the same parameters, same factors were further researched on, and further this agricultural location theory was now based on this theory of marginal productivity and theory of rent. So remember, whenever we talk about agricultural location theory of von Thunen, we must talk about two things, that is this theory of rent and the theory of marginal productivity as the basic theories or the base theories behind the final locational theory. So now let's elaborate the final locational theory. So remember, model of agricultural land by von Thunen was created almost before industrialization, and the idea and the data was all predating the peak of industrialization in Europe, right? So it had certain assumptions. Now when I say it had certain assumptions, remember these assumption based theories are almost like the quantitative theories that we study in the later part of geography as well, right? So what are these? These theories assume an ideal situation and tries to fit in. So kind of deductive, normative, static and deterministic theories, these are the nature of these theories. Now if you want to learn about what are these words called deductive, inductive, nature of these theories, normative theories, you should go to the Evolution of Geographical Thought playlist and watch the videos over there where we have discussed everything in the 42 videos. If you have not watched that playlist, please definitely go there and watch it so that you'll learn about all these aspects of geographical thought before coming to this lecture. Because we are talking about a particular set of theory that's based on the idea of determinism, the idea of deduction and normative values. Now here, remember these are certain assumptions. What do you observe? City is located centrally with an isolated state. Now here the first assumption is basically that a city is isolated. It is not connected to outside world. It is just an isolated city with a single center. So single centric approach. One market, one city center is there, right? Then isolated state is surrounded by wilderness. Then land is completely flat and has no river or mountain. This is also one of the assumptions, that it has no river, no mountain, it's purely flat land. Then soil quality and climate are consistent. It means what? It is kind of an isotropic plane that is similar everywhere. All the point have same potential. That is what is isotropic. Every area is equal in all the aspects, right? So farmers in the isolated state transport their own goods to the market via ox cart. Now remember, we are not talking about a vehicle here, not talking about cars or other means of transport here. Basically only ox cart driven system, that is pre-1826 system, right? So that was important in this theory assumption, which is directly connecting the farmland to the city market. And then there are no roads as in modern roads and flyovers and other stuff. Right? So that's important. Then farmers behave rationally. This is also an assumption here for the ideal state theory, law-making theory, or for that kind of deduction theory, right? And then the idea of maximum profit is always there with economic man concept. So assuming that all the farmers are economic man, they are rational thinkers, their only motive is highest profit making. Now these are the 5-6 assumptions on which this particular theory is based. Now remember, the same kind of assumption will also be learning in Weber's industrial location theory, Kristaller's central place theory, and Lotzian model of location as well. So this is kind of a linkage between these 19th century theory and early 20th century in geography, which we'll be learning in the future lectures to come also. So the land use is considered as function of the cost of transport to market. Now here, remember, everything has been in a deterministic manner in this statement. What is determinism here? Remember, X is the function of Y. X is the factor which is caused by Y factor or dependent on Y factor. That is where functional relationship is here, causal relationship is here, deterministic relationship is here, right? So here you observe land use by any farmer in the area depends upon what? Only on the basis of transportation cost, because that is what is varying because of distance. Rest everything has been assumed to be almost ideal, right? Almost constant. So this is kind of a relationship between constant and variables. If you observe carefully, you will find these theories which are of nature of the scientific theories, which talks about lawmaking, where something is constant and something is variable, right? For example, if you take gravitational theory, right? So you have g mm by r square, where g is universal gravitational constant while others are variable. The distance is variable, the mass of one object and other object is different, right? So that kind of approach you will find in such theories, because these are normative theories which are made with an idea of that approach which fits across the world, right? But unfortunately, because it's part of human geography, you will find that these laws or these models and theories that tries to explain the human phenomena are not same like the physical theories or theories of science or pure sciences. That is the line of difference here that you can understand. So what you observe, the land use is basically the function of basic factor, that is your transportation cost, and land rent that a farmer can afford to pay is determined by yield. Now it all depends upon how much is your yield. That is the basic factor on which you will get your money and you will be paying your rent. So transportation cost and your rent, that are two factors that is here, right? So this model is static and deterministic that we have talked in detail now. So if you observe, vonthunen conceived this idea of land use model in both urban as well as rural landscape, but primarily around the city region, right? Because city was the only market available. Single centrism dominated the urban landscape that time. Single centric model. right? So his idea is basically how economic rent decreases with what? From center of the city to periphery. So if this is a city center, if you observe here, as you go to the periphery, what decreases? The economic rent decreases, right? So you see this ring shaped of thought process behind land use. This is the conceptualization, initial conceptualization you can say, before the final conceptualization was basically in 4 zones just by empirical observation. So according to Vonthunen's initial observation, he divided his work into 4 zones of that city and its periphery of land use. What was that? First is your white zone, which is here, just close to the city, which has dairy and market gardening. The second is green zone, which is forest for fuel. Third is yellow zone, which is grains and field crops. And fourth is the red zone, which ranching, the cattle, right? So this is the basic idea, and the outskirt is all full of wilderness. It's all wild area. So it's kind of an isolated system that is created here. This is what was envisaged in his theory in the beginning. And later when he talked about it, he also had certain modifications and the final land use model as well. So if you observe, he envisages rings of forest, crop rotation, horticulture and dairy farming as the 4 major chunks of land uses coming from the German background in early 19th century, if you observe here. Then further, there are certain terminologies that you must consider before you look into the final outlook of this particular or output of this particular theory. So crop productivity, it is measure of the ratio of agriculture output to the input. Then you have crop intensity, or the amount of intensive farming that is being done. That is how many crops are grown in a year or in a season on that agricultural land. Also extensiveness of the same. Then mixed cropping is happening or not. Then what is the hinterland? This hinterland concept is what? The idea where an isolated region is there, and remember, from the center to the periphery till where the services go and services or raw material come back to the city. This is the hinterland, right? So it was talked in the idea that it is an isolated region that is away from the coastline or river. It is somewhere in the center with its own periphery, which is isolated from all others. Then isolated state is what we exactly talked about. The land is completely flat, having equal soil fertility at all the places, and climate as well, right, with no river and mountain. These are the basic building blocks or the framework of the theory of Vonthunen, right? And then finally the economic rent, that is a price a farmer obtains, can be calculated as this particular statement. If you know this statement, you know economic rent. The price at the market minus the cost of transporting it to the market. Just 2 things. What is the price, selling price at the market, and how much did you spend on the transportation cost? 2 factors will give you economic rent of that particular farmer. So economic rent of a crop increases. When it will increase, just think about it. If the location of agricultural land is near the market due to less transportation cost, so what happens? The economic rent value, this rent value is basically the price at the market minus the cost of transporting it. So if your transportation cost is less, then obviously economic rent becomes more near the market. Right? So Vonthunen's concept of economic rent is also called a locational rent many times, because of the reason it is based on particular location, nearby market or nearby city center or far from city center, right? So now looking into economic rent again, all the same variables that we talked earlier was used in this. So it is measure of what? Advantage of one piece of land over the other piece of land, isn't it? So one land is more valued than other. The land around the city area will have more economic rent than the peripheral land. That's what is saying the value part here, right? So since all farmers receive the same price at the market, right, the production costs are also assumed to be these constant here, right? So there is a relationship between something constant and something variable, you can see. The only advantage of one piece of land has over another is its location away from the market or close to the market, which is what is variable. So what is the constant and variable in this equation? You can observe carefully. So according to this, if it's closer to the market, its locational rent is higher and it reduces with distance, right? And this he formulated through this particular equation, if you observe. So LR is equal to Y bracket M minus C bracket close minus YTD. Now what is this? Here is LR, the locational rent or economic rent that we say per unit of land, which is equal to Y yield per unit of land, M market price, C is production cost per unit of product, T is transportation rate per unit of distance, and D is the distance from the market. This is the final economic rent calculation under Vonthunen's agricultural location theory, right? So what happens? The theory has further two parts. One is called crop intensity based theory of agricultural location, which is here represented in this particular diagram. If you can observe, what you see in this diagram is this is the market center, and you have intensive cultivation near the market and extensive cultivation away from the market. Why? Because observe this statement. Due to rise in transportation cost, what happens? Intensive cultivation is mostly suited near the city center only, because if you do intensive cultivation away, your cost will increase, right? That's why farmers will only benefit in intensive cropping where there is nearness to the market, right? That's where intensity theory is. So near to the market, intensive cropping. And what about extensive cropping? Extensive pattern of cropping is observed as you go away from the market, right? So locational rent of extensive cropping becomes lesser here, but locational rent of intensive cropping is greater here, isn't it? So you see, as you go close to the market, your rent increases. So with intensity and rent, you observe this particular graph of crop intensity model. And the second model is about the production concept, the crop productivity theory. According to this crop productivity theory that you say, variation in land use with distance and factors responsible for the variation are these factors. What is this factor? Market price of particular crop, transportation cost, production cost, and yield per unit of land. Remember these four factors. These four factors are the land use determinants, because it's a deterministic theory. So it has two cases. Now observe the first case here. In first case, P and Q are two crops, right? So they have same production cost. Now remember, this is same, this is constant, and yield as well. So this is also constant, but having different transportation cost. Now this is variable, this is same, right? And market prices are also different. So you have this as variable, this as variable, this as constant, and this as constant. So two variables, two constants in this particular situation. So what is going to happen? Just look here in this particular graph. So case one is if the market price of crop Q was greater than crop P. So observe here, if P is costlier to transport and has higher market price, in that case what will happen? Remember, crop P we are talking about. So if P is here costlier than Q, obviously, and has greater transportation cost and higher market price, then crop P will be grown closer to the market, obviously, because one would not like to pay more on transportation. You would like to save on transportation if you want more profit, because profit maximization is the basic here, right? So if you want to maximize your profit on crop P, what will you do? You will obviously choose near location. So this is the location where you will plot this particular crop P, isn't it, in this case? And Q will be away from the market. That's important here in the first case. And what about the case 2? In case 2, when two crops X and Y have same production and transportation cost, but different market price and yield. Now the variables change. Market price and yield per unit land is different. In this case, what will happen? So in this case, X has a higher yield and lower market price than Y. It will be grown closer to the market Y. Because what will happen, if X has higher yield and lower market price, obviously where would you like to save again? On the transportation cost, because you will have lesser money because of the lower market price. So where will you save for your maximum profit? Only on transportation cost. That's the reason again crop X will be close to market here, Y will be away from market, because Y anyway has greater market price, so it can distribute its market price and spend something on the transportation. So as a farmer, if you think of maximization of profit, in the second case also, what will you do? You will plant your crop X near the market. That's the whole idea, the second case. So you carefully observe the linkages between these constants and variables. Every time you observe, what is the basic determinant? The transport cost minimization. Farmers would not love to pay more on transport. The prices that fluctuate according to market or production, all will be adjusted according to this particular distance and transportation cost, right? That's where profit maximization will be done in such situation, assumed situation or ideal situation. So finally, vonthunen arrived to his concentric zonal rings of agricultural production, and these are the land uses when he finally plotted it. That is 6 concentric zonal rings. Right? Earlier it was just 4 rings as he assumed. Later on it was 6 rings. So from city center, this is your city center, right? In the core, what is the other part nearby city center? This is market gardening and milk production. Why is it so? Because remember, market gardening and milk production are all perishable goods, right? They perish in short time. So to supply and sell it quickly, you need to be close to the market, right? Then firewood and lumbering production is in the next zone here, right? Then green crops with no fallow land is in the third zone here. And then fourth zone is grain crops with 14% fallow, and 3 field system is here in the next one. And lastly, you have all the ranchers and cattle grazers here in the last zone. So this was land use, and this land use was determined by nothing but transportation cost, because in every other aspect, rest of the things like the farm productivity, the capability of the farm produce, and other factors were assumed to be almost constant. So the only factor was, as you go away from the market or city center, the land use changes according to this particular location theory, right? Later on, what happened? Many modifications were also adjusted in Vonthunen's model. Vonthunen was not a very rigid scholar in terms that what he gave was the final theory. So later on also he accepted many modifications looking into the actual land use and many other factors that he further added, and many other scholars also added it later on. So the modifications in Vonthunen model of agricultural location are these modifications. So now look, introduction of a navigable river. So if the city center is connected from the periphery by a navigable river, it means there is an alternative to the main transport of the ox cart, right? People can also transport so many things using river, right? Inland transportation. So that is what he introduced later on. Then accordingly land use will change. So if you observe, alongside the river you find this now single centrism or concentric model is a little elongated or sectoralized literally, right? So elongation of production zones, if you see along the river, extension of zone 2 as well you find, because 2 was about the lumbering industry, which is basically log of wood. So imagine log of wood will be floated in the river and it will automatically come to the market. So you have saving on transportation costs through the ox cart. That's why you see this zone 2 had elongation here, right? So then further, if you observe, consideration of more than one market also was further added, or minor market was further added, right, in the periphery, right? Apart from that, possibility of numerous small towns and also intermixing of production zones was what further it was modified and added. That is the major point to remember here. At last, when we critically evaluate this theory, what you observe? The conditions described in the model, that is of isolated state, an ideal system where everything is almost equal, only variation is on the basis of rent, that is on the basis of transportation cost, are hardly available in any region of the world. That's why you cannot relate this theory, which is a very ideal state theory, to the practical world. That is one criticism. Then Vonthunen's assumptions that there are no spatial variations in soil types and climate is virtually not possible. Why is it not possible? Because we see there is a soil diversity, geodiversity, geoclimate diversity, even microclimatic regimes change just in kilometers of land use, isn't it? Then it is not necessary that all types of farming systems are described by Vonthunen in his theory. So there are several other kinds of farming systems also. Then Vonthunen's measure of economic rent and intensity were also a little complex for people to understand. So it was not practical or practicably applicable in the open ground in the agricultural regions of the world. And Vonthunen himself as well admitted that with the change in location of transportation or market center, the pattern of land use will also change, right? So in 21st century, if you observe, everything has changed. Science and technology has literally changed the idea of space and time. So if you observe, these theories are still validated, but in pockets, not in totality, because land use has modified. So still we study Vonthunen only because he admitted that there is a possibility of change in this theory as the land use changes, as the technology changes. So he left a scope for the modification and change as well. So now, when we have learned in details about the agricultural location theory of Vonthunen, in the sessions to come, we'll be talking more on such locational theories such as Weber's industrial location, Christaller's central place theory, Lossian model, and others. So stay tuned, stay safe, Keep watching and don't forget to share it with others as well.